Remember when we used to talk about the paperless office?
E-commerce?
Signing a contract on paper.
And even giving out an agent's pager number?
We're in a mobile world.
We're in a mobile world, and your business needs to be too.
It's a digital world.
Workflow is changing, and so too are our experiences.
There are over 350 PropTech players right now
Competing for the space.
How do you keep up with it all? And what's next?
Welcome to Founders.
A new podcast with Josh Phegan
On the future of workflow in real estate.
It's a highly competitive world, and if you're going to be seriously good in business, you've got to learn how to compete. So what do the best agents and agencies really do to make sure that they compete in that highly competitive world? Well, today on Founders, we've got Belinda Sinclair, Head of Sales and Agent Performance across Australia and New Zealand for Domain. Belinda, it's so great to have you here today. You get to see a lot of things well before anyone else gets to see them. Let's talk a little bit about what are some of the great insights and some of the things that you've seen that are going to pick up on some trends. And today I know we're going to talk about audiences and market shifts and positioning for brands. Overall, literally, what does it feel like to be able to be semi the oracle, to be able to see some of the things that are going to happen before they actually happen in industry?
Well, hello, Josh. Awesome to be talking today. And absolutely, that's one of the things I love and am privileged to have as part of my job is the ability to see data and trends and what's happening both across Australia and New Zealand, but be able to hone into markets and micro markets, as I call it, to see what key trends are happening there and be able to guide the conversations and talk to our agent partners on how do they prepare for the upcoming season.
Yeah, this is a really interesting thing for any agency because you've seen lots of different trends, and I think that Domain has been able to provide some great insights about, for example, the whole let's get it listed on Boxing Day for January and do lots of auctions into early February. That's certainly been a trend in certain sections of Australia which really push volume. Also too about trying to encourage agents to sell over a winter period or being able to make sure they get ready for a spring period. But you can actually see all of the trends around when are people actually uploading properties, how long the property's actually staying on market for, whether or not a market's starting to improve, in other words, that the speed at which they're selling, or literally a lower level of listings or a high level of listings. It must be pretty interesting to watch. Are city environments better than regional environments, or is it something that constantly evolves and changes over time?
Yeah, that's why I was actually at a presentation last week and we were mapping out the lower North Shore of Sydney, upper North Shore and the northern suburbs and watching the lower North and upper North Shores really driven by what's ever happening with seasonality, the school holidays, public holidays, and then you have a market like the northern suburbs sitting alongside that's bucking the trend and having peak listing volumes while the others are, a lot softer. So I love being able to, and I think that's one of the opportunities that probably our partners take for granted and don't use their domain partners enough is to ask us about the data that we're seeing so they can plan for the season ahead. And whether you're in, a softer winter, and does that mean you're going to come in and have a boom spring, and how do you prepare for that? And how do you use that data and insights to actually help you guide the conversation with your vendor rather than just use the standard, listing spring, because that'll be really, really busy. And I see the really quality agents are using that insight to be able to guide those conversations within those micro markets.
The interesting thing about this is learning how to read the market. The way that I used to know that I was in spring was that one of our competitors down the road used to put some daffodils in the window with a little sign that said "Spring has sprung," and I was like, "Oh, that means we better get on and start listing." And now I'm actually very different, where I actually look, specifically about data and insights. And one of the things that I've looked at a little bit has actually been photographers' bookings. So if I can actually get a photographer's bookings around when are they photographing properties, that probably then gives me an idea about then when it's then going to be loaded to Domain. And so what I would actually say to agents that, hey, if you're in a holiday market or whether or not you're in a normal mum and dad market, what actually does happen? And the interesting thing is that I reckon that post Melbourne Cup, a lot of agents tend to stop listing properties for this year and they start listing them for next year. But I asked the photographers, how many times do you have to move the Christmas tree out of the photo? And they said not many, which means that ultimately they're in a position that probably they really start to slow down by that first week of December, and they don't really pick up tools until probably mid-January in a lot of markets. And what we've actually seen is a reverse of that trend, that some of the best agents in the country are really focused about saying, hey, let's list as much as we can in that first week to 2 weeks of November to get ready for our campaigns for the start of of, believe it or not, 2026 and beyond. That's actually a really interesting thing that you've seen a lot of about where agents are looking to partner with you and to say, hey, look, what can we do to make sure that we get the right audience? And I guess that's one of the biggest things for any real estate agent is it's fine to say, okay, great. I've got a website, I've got some email, I've got something I can go to put on social. But what you're now really starting to think about is how audiences are changing. Now, I think about how you get to me as a consumer, and I'm really, really hard because the basic foundational idea is that I probably don't watch much TV. I'm not really reading many newspapers. So from that point of view, how do you actually get access to me? But there's one thing that I know, and I know you're going to maybe cringe a little bit here for 2 seconds, but the way that I know that I'm ready to change house is I re-download the domain app and start searching again. And that's kind of that thing, because once I bought, I delete it, just for a couple of weeks and then bring it back on. Is that an interesting thing about audiences? How do we build audiences? What's Domain's audience like these days in terms of helping me to be able to get in front of more consumers more often?
Absolutely. And I think anyone who wants to be competitive and at the top of their game in their market needs to make sure they can look a vendor in the eye and, say to them that we've been able to maximise the reach and the exposure of your property. And I think, what I've seen over the last few years in real estate is in some markets, some agents get lazier. And as the pressure comes on in terms of wondering how, the vendors with VPA shock and wondering what it costs to sell a house these days are surprised by the changes over the last 5 or 10 years. And there's a quick race to the bottom. And what I worry about is that we start to get lazy in an industry rather than educate ourselves and educate the vendors. And you use the domain site as an example where you've got over 7 million users growing over 10% year on year. So that market continues to increase. And there's over 1 million people who are using Domain who are not using any other platforms. And so when the question is, how do I make sure that I'm marketing and exposing the property to every possible potential buyer, whether they're Josh who have just re-downloaded the app or someone who's been scrolling for months and years trying to find their property, you don't want to miss a buyer. And I think there's just a handful of key insights that an agent needs to educate themselves on to be able to articulate in less than 30 seconds, why do I need to load on Domain? Why do I need to use social media? Why do I need drone photography? And your response and your confidence in that response, the minute you're asked from a vendor, is going to guide that trust and confidence in you as an agent.
And this is that whole conversation about sometimes consumers are not even aware of what their behavior is until someone actually points out that that's your behavior. So a really basic foundational idea, I went through a really lovely listing in Balmain. The agent invited me to come and have a quick look. I went and had a look at the listing. And as I left, I received an SMS. There's Home Pass in action. And I click on the link and literally then see the property again. That's fine. But what I actually do with the link is I then forward it on to my good friend Con. I forward it on to my mum. And you wouldn't believe it, 3 or 4 days later, my mum rings me and she goes, "Oh, honey, have you bought that house yet?" I'm like, "What do you mean?" She goes, "It's following me all across social media." And so naturally the agents use Social Boost. And then it's literally then finding that audience even to the stakeholders who are then influencing the decision. Now, the interesting foundational idea is that, what we're really seeing, and this is in the old school days, you're going to put it onto Domain and that's going to be it. Whereas now you're actually saying, well, hang on a second, there's a whole suite of tools that are available that come with that. So there's things, for example, that what you're doing in terms of the email blasts or e-brochures that go out. Then there's the conversation of bumping it up and down in terms of the search results. Then there's the whole part about saying, okay, now we're going to add the social boost component to it. And understanding that at different stages throughout the course of your campaign, you now have different tools that actually make it really flexible as a part of your subscription. And why this is important for an agent, if you're about to sell a property, maybe use that bump or maybe use that social boost. If you're in a position to do that extra email blast, if you've got a price change, then ultimately know what tools that you've actually got available. How important is it now for agents to start to really think about the improvement, of that audience, but also to using the different tools at different stages inside of the campaign to grow the audience at impactful moments?
Yeah, because we know we only have a few weeks that we are trying to maximise the audience and the exposure of the property. And what we want to do is, one, capture the attention. We want to be seen, make sure the property's seen, but then we want the property seen over and over again and in different environments. And as you talked about, the way that having that complementary suite of solutions in terms of where that property is going to be exposed, from when they jump onto the app to when it's fed up in social, to when they receive it in a notification on their app, to when they reveal a EDM or email blast on that property, we know we start to create that repetitious behaviour where people do feel like a property's following them and start to feel like that's a sign that maybe that's home for them. And we don't know sometimes at what point in time we are being fed up, we are feeding up that listing, because if someone's running to drop off the kids and quickly see the property, it's probably not going to resonate. But if someone's scrolling on a Saturday morning and it's fed up while they're having a coffee, that starts to really sink in. And we know they're the times that you get your increase in email inquiries or shares or saves, as you referred to as well, Josh. So I think really important not just to allow that you are going with a solution that's going to or be automated to feed up where it needs to go to the right people at the right time, but that you have control to, influence that campaign and, how it's going to be accelerated. And if you have a great weekend of open for inspections, that's often not to get complacent about the campaign, but how do you ramp up? How do you start making sure that you have, 10 groups through on a Saturday? How do you make sure you bring the 10 back and add another 10 because that's the week you pushed out your social or email alert as well?
And this is a really important part too, is of when an objection continually comes up, how do you learn how to overcome that objection? And so one of the things that I had an agent saying the other day, hey, I'm about to go and list this property, it's out of area for me. And one of the concerns is that we don't have a database of buyers in that area because we're not the dominant agent. And I said to him, well, why don't you just talk to them about domain early access? He's like, oh, okay, well, yeah, tell me how that works. And that's that whole conversation about saying, well, Domain actually does know all of the buyers that are sitting in there. And you've got now very specific audiences that you can get access to prior to launching, and then also to when you're then on the market and then retargeting those particular audiences. So it's not just about the size of the audience, it is also too about the quality of that audience. And what we're now starting to see, I saw some research the other day about 6 to 8 hours a day on a mobile device. And we're now hearing that Australians are having trouble about walking from one room to the next without watching a video whilst they do it. So tell us a little bit about the Reels part as a part of Platinum Edge and what's happening there now.
Yeah, we're really mindful, as you said, consumer behaviour changing, and a scary behaviour is how much time we're spending on our phones and even on Reels. And I know that micro behaviour of I'll just have a quick scroll on the way to the bathroom or the kitchen. And so just a couple of months ago, we launched a new feature into Domain Platinum Edge. So in addition, we already are the only platform that includes a social media rollout and expansion in our listing product of Platinum Edge, but also that now we've converted and create videos or Reels because we know that's how people are searching. And the engagement is 2 to 3 more times likely to engage with that video content when it's shared as a Reel opposed as stagnant.
Or static.
A static.
Yeah.
Static photo.
And that's that whole conversation is that literally someone was saying to me that this whole live content's a really important part because it's almost in some respects that static is dead in isolation. But yet if they get in via the video, they click on it, then they go to the static, then they're going to go through the photos, they look at the floor plan, they read the body copy. I found myself doing that on the weekend, not looking to move, Belle, but I was scrolling on the Domain app. And that's that whole conversation around really looking at things and understanding it. Apart from audience, then it's also too about the conversation around market shifts. And one of the things that, we've ridden some wild markets. I started my training career in the middle of the GFC. I remember getting in the back of a taxi and the taxi driver said, oh, how are you going? I said, my business is awesome. We've done double the numbers of last year. He said, mate, nearly everyone's losing their job. How are you doing that? I'm like, I just did nothing last year, but that basic idea is about really learning about growth. Tell us a little bit about what are some of the early indicators of things that you look and how you can predict some of the market shifts, and what are some of the things that Domain collects as data that's a really useful insight for agents?
Yeah, well, as a general rule, I think one interesting insight, and you talked about the GFC, is what's happening with consumer sentiment. And if we look at, I think people will be surprised to know we are just coming out with some more positive uplifts in consumer sentiment over the last few months. But the last couple of years, consumer sentiment has been in line with as negative or as pessimistic as it was in the pandemic and then at the GFC. So we've had some tough times, but we are seeing positivity come out in the market in terms of consumer sentiment. We're seeing strong auction clearance rates. We're seeing interest rates drop, hallelujah. And what the data is showing us is if you watch that combination of what's happening with auction clearance rates, what's happening with days on market, what's happening with listing volumes, you can often start to predict or at least prepare and educate a vendor on what the market looks like now and where we expect it to be over the next few months. And I use an example that happened a couple of months ago where we were seeing really high interest rates. So interest rates sitting in the 70% in most markets around the country. But then we were also seeing days on market peak at some of the highest days it's been over the last few years. And so you've got this interesting conundrum. If you're taking the property to auction, then you might have a great chance of selling the property. But if it doesn't sell, then it may be sitting on the market for 50, 60, 70 days. Mm-hmm. And so I said, using that sort of indicator in terms of what does that tell us about buyers, what does that tell us about vendors and price expectations, really helps to guide, I think, making decisions on one, what's the best method to take the property to market, and how do I educate the vendor on why we need to go all in on selling this at auction or soon after, because there is the reality of longer days on market and how we manage that, and even planning out with the vendor on what that campaign could look like in the lead up to the auction, and if by any chance we didn't sell, how do we prepare to close it soon after as well.
Founders is brought to you by Josh Phegan Digital. When we were setting out to go and create Josh Phegan Digital, we just had this whole idea that we wanted training to be on demand. And everything in our life is on demand. We just press play inside of the Netflix app. We press play on YouTube, play on Spotify. Why couldn't we just press play on training? And what we decided is we want to be super relevant to real estate agents, so that in under a couple of minutes each day, if you wanted to, you could upskill and you could grow in new ways. And so we decided that we were going to release this thing that we called The Edit, which is basically the latest in property news stories that's happening every week right the way around the country. So you could be incredibly sharp in your conversations with sellers. And then we built out the short courses, which was all about rapidly building skills, whether or not it's about learning how to get better fees or to put on an assistant. And then we actually wanted to give you access to blueprints, so you didn't have to wait for it every year. You could just watch it whenever you wanted and actually go from zero to hero around everything that it takes, from goal setting, self and energy management, what you're doing around prospecting, listing, negotiation, and actually just have a system for the way that you work. Together with, getting really inspired by some of the best people in the industry with the black and white interviews. Josh Phegan Digital is available on iOS and also on Android. It's an incredible app, and it gives you everything that you'll need to be a much better agent. It's time to switch on.
I have a client that I do work with in Double Bay who shall remain nameless, but he does a lot of the very, very high-end transactions. And he said to me, it either sells in the first 3 weeks or it takes 3 years. And it just starts to get you to think that, from this perspective, it's about understanding, sale method and approach is a really important conversation. And we don't really talk about it as much. It's a very US term about inventory.
Yes.
And so let's say, for example, there's 100 houses in a market and there's 10 selling a month. That means you have 10 months worth of inventory. If all of a sudden that 10 sales a month goes to 20, then now all of a sudden you only have 5 months worth of inventory. And so that actually suggests that the market's starting to move. And so one of the early indicators is how many new properties are coming to market, how many properties are actually selling each month, which will start to give you a bit of an improvement idea about whether or not things are starting to move. And then I have a look at borrowing capacity. So how much money can Josh go to borrow, but also to servicing costs. So what does it cost him to actually go to service that? And then also in addition to that, what I go to call the mood of the market, or better known sometimes as media sentiment. So are people saying, hey, get in and go and buy and go make this happen? Or are they saying, hey, hold back? And ultimately what you're starting to see is a lot of the reporting that's coming through, particularly on the auction clearance rates. And I think Melbourne's a really clear leader on this, and as is Sydney at the moment, and Brisbane's firing like there's no tomorrow, and so's Adelaide, and so's Perth. Geez, it all feels like it's going pretty well.
Everyone's on fire.
Just no one's mentioned Hobart or Darwin yet, but they are doing really well. And the interesting conversation is that what you're starting to feel is that after a period of bleakness, people look for sunshine. And I think that that's really what I can get on, and I can make a move and actually buy a house or do some of those things. And also too, outside of the cyclical economical trends, there's also much larger shifts. For example, like the shifts in baby boomers. And my dad always said, hey, you know what? We've got a lot of money and not much time. Is that some of the things that literally that you find pockets within pockets of markets that do, or styles of properties that do really well, regardless of the market of the day, because it's going after a segment that literally maybe doesn't pay too much attention to what actually is happening more broadly?
Yeah, definitely. One thing that has been picked up over the last 12 months is the impact of interest rates and how that affects certain markets more than others. Those markets that, people have high borrowing power and have potentially, the hit of high interest rates really impacted them and needed to sell. So I think people were surprised to hear people that owned a $5 million property were really feeling the pinch of the mega mortgage that they had and needing to transact out of that because of how tough that was trying to carry a high mortgage. And you'll have other markets where you pointed out where you might have an older demographic that were perfectly comfortable through high interest rates because they were actually cheering because they had all their money invested. So we do see that shift. It's probably why over the last few months as we see interest rates come down, we've started to see a shift in price out of Sydney and Melbourne and those markets where the impact of having interest rates come down allow them to have significantly more borrowing power or ease the stress of the mortgages and starting to see price. And I think that's another conversation that can be used well in vendors is using price forecasting. And Domain Launch sends out every quarter an update on what are the predictions around price. And the reason, we've got a pretty good track record on getting that reasonably accurate, but the price forecast for the next 12 months across most of the states, particularly Sydney's expected at 6 to 7%, is using that data again to have a conversation with a vendor or a buyer on why buy now, why sell now. And again, I just think a handful of insights can be used if you can educate yourself and use the Domain Research tab in the app to help educate yourself to allow you to have informed decisions and guide your vendors and buyers on what's right for them and the right timing.
And I always say as a great agent, you need to know what do you say to a buyer, what do you say to a seller, and what do you say to a current vendor to allow them to be able to proceed at today's market price, and whatever that is. And that's a really important foundational conversation. With all of those market shifts that actually goes on, you also to get the benefit of being right next to businesses and having a look at their profitability, their performance, their efficiency. And what we've seen is ultimately over the last 5 or so years, there was a massive explosion in the amount of property technology that was available. Talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing people now starting to do, as ultimately to try to drive profitability or drive margin. And are there any things that they should be looking at inside of their tech stack to see, do they actually need that app anymore?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one because, as you said, over the last 5 years, been an explosion of tech solutions. And as business owners wanting to always create that competitive advantage, stay productive, create an efficient business, there's been a lot of businesses that has been just, writing up, yes, I'll take that new feature, yes, I'll take that new product, and haven't watched the output in terms of how much they're spending month on month on those subscriptions. And what I do encourage, Domain, like a whole lot of other prop techs, do launch new products and new features, but we encourage our businesses to take a tech stock take as such and make sure on an annual review, schedule it in maybe for the start of the year when you're a little bit quieter in the winter downturn to review all your tech, understand what are you purchasing that is a feature versus what is a product, reviewing what within your product suite may have that product already launched a feature that you're buying from someone else as a separate subscription, and look at how you can actually create efficiencies for yourself, because I know it's not sustainable to just keep adding on subscription after subscription after subscription. And we know tech moves fast and the innovations keep coming out, and we want to have the capacity to be able to invest in the next solution that's actually going to drive the right competitive advantage for your business, knowing that tech, can get out of date pretty quickly as well. And
this is the big conversation too, is that that retraining cost of making sure that you get everyone across how things work is often, quite an expensive thing about an organisation getting into change. But what I would say is that ultimately too, and I love that whole idea of like sometimes what should have been a feature became a product. And now what you're actually seeing is that literally the products are now keeping up with some of those features, bringing them back in-house. And you're now finding that some of those existing products you've already got have got a lot more features than what you were aware of, and yet you're paying for a subscription that does exactly that one little part, which is now part of the bigger game. As a conversation also to what you're really good at is helping people with positioning. And I always think about this is that literally, if you're not going to be the cheapest real estate agent in the marketplace, then how are you planning on winning? And to me, that's always about design. So really thinking through what you do, when you do it, and how it works. Now, I've used this for a long time, but I say, hey, you go into a restaurant, hey, lovely to see you. Adam, may I take your jacket? Quick question, would you like some sparkling or some still water? And did you want the Antipodes from New Zealand or the San Pellegrino from Italy? Now there's a choice of sparkling sparkling water, that's probably quite an expensive meal. If, however, you walk in and you say, may I have some water? Yeah, sure, taps in the corner. Or any cups? No, just use your hands. That's probably a very different price point. Now, neither are bad, by the way. And some of those are really important. Maybe after the kids' school sports, it's a quick little thing. Go and get that, make it happen. Very, very different to the fine dining dinner, which might be representing an anniversary or something else that's more broadly going on. When you think about agents and understanding of brand and thinking about how they go to position that brand, and I get people who are like, I've been positioned that I can only sell apartments and I can never sell houses, or geez, I only ever sell houses. I wish I had some of the apartment market. And then I've got other people like, I won't take on anything under a certain price point. Then I've got other agents who say, Josh, I'll sell in all price points. I'm not in a position that I'm too good to sell anything, but it needs to be the best property in terms of its presentation in each price range. So talk to us a little bit about positioning and what people should consider when they're trying to position a property, when they're trying to position a brand and position themselves as an agent.
Yeah, great question, Josh. And I think for me, like you said, it doesn't matter what area of the market you're in. There's a decision to be made about how you want to be perceived and what is your positioning within the market. And I take that both you individually as an agent and you as an agency and business as well. And what I worry about in terms of that decision is people start off their career just wanting to build maybe volume because they're new into the market. And so they position themselves as, I can go in cheap, I'm just going to sell fast, and that's how I build my reputation, and realize all too quickly that now they are positioned as that cheap and dirty agent. I actually hope you're very clean, but, cheap agent who just gets in, gets out and does the job, and then wonder why they can't break into the more premium markets or in the higher thresholds. And so what I think you need to create a standard for yourself on how you want to be perceived, and that goes into how you market your properties, how you market yourselves, how you position your brand, how you present yourself, how you present your properties. And I'll use the example of the premium market, and I know there are a lot of agents who aspire to be either in the premium price points within their areas that they work within, or who are trying to move in and grow market share in adjacent suburbs where there is more premium marketplace. And so there is a suite of solutions that you need to get yourself across and educate yourself on that how we market well premium properties. And this is one of the, I think, points of difference of Domain. We see that Domain is a premium marketplace, high intent, high value audiences who come and search, particularly in our ability to reach passive audiences through publications like our Domain, Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, and our prestige publications. And so what that does is allow us to reach a more passive buyer. And there's a suite of solutions that someone who wanting to position themselves into those premium markets should make sure they're educated on. I'll use an example. So in Melbourne recently, we launched the Prestige magazine. It's both a Melbourne-focused and national-focused publication for premium properties. And I was talking to an agent a few weeks ago who ended up losing the listing in the premium market because they didn't present a print solution. They only presented the regular digital solution. And the feedback is I just didn't trust that you knew the premium game and the premium market because you didn't even propose that we should look at those different publications and options to expose the property. And I think that's what I get surprised about, that so many agents are focusing on how quickly I can reduce the marketing cost, reduce the exposure, because I believe that'll win me the listing, where someone who presents with confidence, who shows they know the recipe on how to get a great price in a premium market, are the ones who are going to really win the business.
And this is a really interesting conversation. I've got a saying that, customer experience equals brand, and brand therefore equals pricing power. And the story is the one about, what Warren Buffett says is that literally he likes to buy brands that have pricing power. So as an example, you walk into a restaurant and you're a non-drinker and they say, what would you like? Oh, could I please have a Coca-Cola? Oh, sorry, we've only got Pepsi today. And if you're an avid Coca-Cola fan, you're like, but for $1, I can get you the Coca-Cola in the glass bottle. and how many people would pay the extra dollar. And I think a lot of people actually would.
Yeah.
So from that point of view, that brand has got pricing power. Now, if you think about it, how they present the product, where it's positioned, what it looks like, the packaging, all of those things are a really important foundational idea. And what a lot of agents probably haven't yet thought about is that the way that they actually go to position a property in how it looks. So think about the photography, the videography, what you're then doing in terms of the actual copy itself, the floor plan, and then the activations that when you're starting to think about what are we doing in terms of the reels, and then also to additional video content that might be going onto social over time, and then really thinking about the integrated campaign. And so when you're thinking about whether or not it be a physical brochure in a physical publication, also then in an alternate spot that a consumer might not realize that they're looking at. And so this might be, for example, like dream homes, where all of a sudden you happen to discover something which is a passive audience as opposed to having high intent on looking in that particular location. And this is a really important, foundational idea. I was, for example, I was speaking to you actually about a property that I saw in Hobart recently that was actually on that dream homes. And I looked at that and I'd never really had that on my agenda, but it was this beautiful writer's retreat. I was like, oh, that'll be cool. I'll be able to write the daily email from there. And then I realized it's probably a bit expensive. But that whole idea is that literally I saw something that I would never have seen because I don't have that in my search criteria as my favorited searches on domain. So this is interesting about thinking about what you can do. But agents really need to start thinking about the way that you sell vendor paid marketing, how you therefore position every listing makes a huge difference. Now, I have to drive around a few corners to get to my house in Balmain, and on one of the corners, there's an old unit block, and I've seen a particular brand that's out of area, that's listed one, and that signboard has been up for a while. And then there's the local agent has listed one in the building, and within a week, they've got a sold sticker on theirs. And then another one of their boards has also gone up, and I reckon there'll be a sold sticker on that in another week or two. But yet the other agent's board, I think, is going to outlast both of their campaigns and still not have a sold sticker. And I always think about that literally the maximization of the audience, the way that you're positioning a property, how you go to present a property will determine whether or not you find your next seller, and also to the sale price that you're going to achieve for your current vendor. So is this an important consideration that when an agent's thinking about positioning, what do I do, when do I do it, and how do I do it to make sure I can actually get the property to sold, and also to get that social proof of results in market?
Yeah, absolutely. I really love this idea of what's the recipes for success in terms of how we market a property, and how does an agent present that with conviction and confidence in terms of showcasing. You're speaking to me because you saw that we just sold the property down the road, that we got a great price and we sold it in, 3 weeks' time. This is the recipe on how we achieve that. And if you want me to achieve the same result, this is the path we need to follow again. And I love to get creative with the approach as well. If you think about positioning of yourself in a property, especially in maybe a unique property, for a premium property, also that opportunity to get access to editorial. And so that's another way that you can have, added value, added reach. And to your point, Josh, someone reading an article around content and a beautiful home in Tasmania is going to touch on a different emotional string in their head and their heart around that property means opposed to someone who's scrolling for very particular criteria. And that's why you're trying to always find this balance of your spread of your marketing and multi-channel media in terms of, am I capturing the person when they're in high intent mode and scrolling and adding all the filters right down to those 3 properties that are going to suit their unique behavior? But how are you appealing to the one that's, sitting in the Qantas lounge scrolling through a publication and just see this incredible property up in Noosa and decide, actually, I should always buy that dream home that I wanted to as a holiday home. And so making sure you're seen everywhere and, touching people in different environments is the way you can really draw on those emotional strings as well.
So it's a really important foundational idea. Like if you're going to compete in a highly competitive world, think about the chapters that you've given us today. Like, what do I do to get in front of a high quality audience with high intent? How do I anticipate anticipate those market shifts, drive efficiencies inside the business, for its own overall profitability and driving margin, and then really think about where I'm positioning as an agent so that I can bring all of that together to make sure I get the opportunity for great properties, but also to sell the existing ones I've got. And now, Belinda, if someone wanted to get in touch with Domain, want to reformat their relationship, have a bit of a think about what they can do to position to become number one, or what they can do to maintain their winning edge if they're already number one, what's the best way for them to interact with Domain and for them to make sure they do a bit of an audit of what they're using to then work out what they need to use in order to be at their best?
Yeah, great question, Josh. And so I absolutely encourage everyone to reach out to your account partner. Every real estate agency who has a relationship with Domain will have, someone that they can actually reach out to, ask for a business review, and we can provide both market data on their business performance, and a whole lot of guidance and opportunities and recommendations on how you can grow from there.
Well, Belinda, we're super lucky to be able to spend some time with you. It's awesome to have Domain doing what they're doing in the marketplace. I know there's some big energy and effort coming shortly in terms of some additional marketing and what we're doing around positioning, but it is a great partner for any real estate agency to make sure they can maximize their audience and get in front of the right buyers and sellers at exactly the right time.